Hey, campfire crew. Let's get it on.
I don't think that's such a good idea.
Dad, I can handle it.
He can handle it.
He doesn't have a choice.
My Haunting That Still Traumatizes Me by My Boy Named Troy. This all started when I was 6 or 7. My life had been surrounded by weird occurrences, but my childhood has never been explained. The day we picked up the keys for our new home, it was exciting and kind of nerve-wracking because of the whole new house, new school and such. The day we picked up the keys, we also met the previous owner, so Mom and Dad sent us off to play with the previous owner's kid, like a parent usually would do. As we were playing, we were also talking about our lives and what grade we were in, the awkward small talk sort of stuff. I can't remember what brought it up, but I remember her saying my nan died in that house. She died of a heart attack that was kind of scary to a kid, but I wasn't ready for what that quite meant. The first night the power wasn't turned on, so we ordered pizza and were eating in the dark with torches and candles. It was really fun. After eating, we asked to go play outside and played tag for a bit. My 2 sisters and I probably played for an hour or two, just tiring ourselves out. We had an old shed that was falling apart on the property that we were told to stay out of because it was dangerous and there were possibly snakes. I didn't like rules, so I went in only to see rope hanging from the ceiling rafters. I ran back to my parents and said someone hung themselves. Dad said it's just a sheep shearing shed, and that they would hang sheep to shear as a kid. That made sense, but as an adult I realized that he only said that not to scare my sisters and me. After that, we went to bed that night, and I had an awful dream where my family was killed and set on fire. I woke up in tears and ran to my parents' room. What I didn't know was these nightmares would happen after on a nightly basis, getting worse and worse as the days went on. A month had passed by now, and we had all settled in. That's when the energy in the house had changed, and Dad had become a very angry person and became very hostile towards mainly myself. So some nights, to get away from the abuse, I would sit outside doing prayers to whoever was listening. I never got answers, but I would see movement coming from the old sheep shed. It would look like someone swinging, and that would scare me to go back inside. After a little while, school had started, so I had that to distract me from what was going on at home. After a long week of school, I was tired and went to sleep, skipping dinner that night. I heard my cupboard door slide open, and I saw this grayish skeletal figure step out and just stare at me from the cupboard. So, with the nightmares and now this, I was obviously scared, but I knew whatever it was loved that. So I picked up the courage and yelled, "You don't scare me!" I still regret saying that to this day, because this thing climbed out of my cupboard, walked up my wall onto the ceiling above my bed, and was screaming slurs and profanity, talking about how it was going to kill my family and make me watch. That terrified me. And again, it loved it, because it would smile this massive, dark, toothless grin. I started to not get proper sleep because I was scared of the nightmares, and if I did sleep, I would sleep in one of my sisters' rooms on the floor without them knowing, since getting hit and yelled at by them was more comforting than my room. I eventually got into a lot of trouble with my parents. I had to brave the nights as it got worse over time, realizing this thing could touch me. It would pin me down on my bed, screaming, "You should kill yourself, and here, I'll make it easy." My dad's hunting knife would be sitting at the end of my bed, nicely placed. And I knew what it wanted me to do, but I wouldn't, and that made it really mad. Weeks had passed, and nothing had changed. The holidays were coming up, so we planned to go away, and my mom had to get a coworker to look after the dogs and the cat. After we got back from our lovely holiday, we found out the coworker had left because something dark had chased her. She said the house was evil. Unfortunately, our cat somehow got locked in my room, leading him to pee on the floor. We ended up having to pull up the entire floor. That same week, we found a small bird injured, so we decided to nurse it back to health. It stayed in my room since it was just concrete flooring, because we hadn't replaced the floor yet. I can't remember why we went to the shops, But when we got back, my fan was off, my window was shut, and the bird was dead at the bottom of the cage, with my room feeling like a sauna. I said to my parents, "The man in my cupboard killed the bird." They said, "You probably forgot and did it yourself." Dad and I had a massive fight that night, leading to my biggest bashing. My head was spinning as I laid on the floor, and I cried and asked for death. A couple of days later, I had my first ever seizure and remembered seeing a lady all in black, only finding out recently my heart had actually stopped, and my mom had to thump my chest to get it started again. After that, I started seeing people I now know are spirits. It scared me at first, but then I got comfortable with it. And after a while, the lack of sleep and abuse from Dad, I started having twisted dreams and thoughts of stabbing him in his sleep. Years passed, and we finally moved out. I was excited to leave that old life behind, but after a while I started talking about the old house in detail with the family, only to find out that they had their own stories. Mom had once been chased down the hallway by the same thing that traumatized me. My oldest sister would rather wait up all night till sunrise because at night she would see something standing in the hallway, feeling like it was going to attack her. Hearing their stories gave me a sense of relief knowing what I had experienced was real, but that scared me even more. It's been 9 years since that house. It still scares me, but if it wasn't for that, I would never have learned about demonology and the not-so-kind spirits. I understand anyone reading this going, this all sounds made up. I wish it was, but hopefully this reaches the right people. I just want to say, you will make it out of your nightmare situations. Just stay strong. The Guys in Robes, submitted by Andy K. I never shared the story with anyone, and seeing as how the person who shared it with me is no longer alive, sadly, I figured what the hell. I found your channel last week, and I like it. It's pretty good. Oh, here goes my story. I grew up with my friend Will since we were 4. Our moms were friends, so therefore we were too. We were inseparable, although we had very different interests in a lot of ways. And still, we always hung out, got into trouble, went to each other's games, double-dated with our girlfriends, and we were both in each other's weddings. What happened on this night, though, was something that went down when we were in 9th grade. It was a Friday night, and Will was going to stay over at my house. My parents were going out, so we figured we could sneak a couple of beers in the garage and then have a cigar. Yeah, 9th grade and smoking cigars. Morons. It was about 7 in the evening when my parents took off, and we were just shooting some hoops in my driveway and having a couple of cold Jenny lights. And this happened in a town outside of Rochester, New York, by the way. It was late September, and a few weeks before this night, a teenage kid around our age killed a girl and her baby in the elementary school parking lot. And that's a true story. If anyone wants to look it up, just search for Palmyra, New York. Palmyra is also where Joseph Smith started the Mormons, but this kid was said to have killed the two under satanic circumstances. I remember there was a meeting at our school about it, and everyone in the area was really freaked out about it. Anyone from the late 80s and early 90s should remember the whole everything is satanic movement. But as far as I was concerned, the kid was just crazy. But the Satanism thing stuck, and I was interested in the occult like any normal person. So Will and I were starting to feel that warm tingle from the beer and decided it would be a smart move to take a couple more and head down to the schoolyard where the murders happened and kind of just look around. I got a backpack and put some jennies in there, grabbed 2 flashlights and our Swisher Sweets, and off we went, staying in the shadows of the fall night. It took us a little while to walk to the school, and we wanted to sneak in and not just walk right in under the main lights. And that would be a sure way to have someone see us and call the cops. On the way there, we were being morbid dorks talking about maybe we would find something gross from the murders or some real evidence of satanic cult action. Yep. Young, dumb, and totally disrespectful. We got to the school and I remember saying, I don't even know where it happened. How can we find anything? Will just said, we'll look around, and then he opened a beer. We lit our cigars and walked around the school building looking for God knows what. Actually nothing. And we sat down after a while and were just talking about these two girls we liked. The hunt for gore and Satan took a back seat to the ladies. I was starting to get pretty buzzed after another 2 beers, and we both started to laugh at everything we were saying. I remember laughing so hard at one point that Will said to stop because he was going to throw up as he couldn't stop laughing. Then I looked up into some trees a little ways away from where we were, as we were leaning against the school. I saw what looked like 2 guys standing in church robes. Now, this wasn't like a forest. There were houses right behind the trees. At first I thought it was someone trying to scare us away as a joke, and I just burst out laughing again. Will said to shut up, and then looked over, saw them, and he froze. "Guy's got an axe," was all he said, and was scrambling to get up. Before I could do anything, Will started running for the street, and I yelled, "Hey, wait up!" I tripped over my stupid backpack, and as I was getting up, the 2 robed figures were walking towards me. I grabbed my bag, got up, and ran after Will. He was waiting at the street. We looked back to see the 2 figures standing right outside a parking lot light. We were scared as hell, even if it was someone just playing a prank. I said we needed to leave, and we started walking down the street really fast. We were in the village, and everything was pretty much closed up for the night. But we had to walk a ways home and go over Erie Canal to get back to my house. As we were walking fast, I got a weird feeling that we were being watched as other cars went by, but when I turned, I saw a car slowly moving behind us. There were no other cars behind whoever that was, so they were taking their time. I mentioned it to Will, he looked back, and we kept moving faster now, freaking out a bit more. It was dark, this car was tailing us, and it was creepy. I thought maybe it wasn't who we saw at the school, but Will said, "Man, it has to be." We got to a bridge at the canal, and as we were crossing, the car sped up and got right behind us and hit their brights. I yelled and ran as fast as I could until we got to the other side, and then I jumped into the ditch, pulling Will with me. The car came up along us and the window rolled down, and all I could see was the bottom half of a face. It was a guy in robes. In a really deep voice, he said, "Go home and don't wander around at night. Halloween is coming. You might be next to die." Or something like that. I can't really remember it word for word. But I do remember all he had to say was we'd be dead. That I'm sure he said. The car moved off, and we finally got the nerve to get up and run back to my house. We ran up the driveway and sat down in my garage looking at the road. We still had some beer in my bag, and we drank them whispering over and over about what we had just seen. Every once in a while, a car would go by, and we'd freak out. Finally, we went inside. Will said we should just watch some TV and forget about everything. It was just a couple of guys messing around trying to scare us. Well, they did. I was scared. I kept looking out the front window, and finally, around midnight, I saw what I was looking for. At the edge of my yard, a car was parked, and 2 guys in their robes were standing there. One held up an arm and pointed it at me as I looked out the window. Then they got back in their car and drove off. I ran to the phone, but Will pointed out that we had had some beers and we should just let it go unless they came back. We shut all the lights in the house off and went to my room and just started talking again. Then came a tap at my window on the 2nd floor, like someone throwing a pebble at it. Whoever it was, how'd they know we were in there? All the lights were off. But these pebbles kept hitting the window until I went over, opened the window, and yelled to get the hell away from us. I heard some laughter and looked down. There was a guy in robes. But he wasn't alone, and I looked up and saw 3 more standing at a car at the road. "Come on down, kid," he said. "I'll make it quick. Quicker than the last kid." That was it. I slammed the window, ran to our hallway phone, and called the cops. They came out just as my parents were coming home, and we told everyone everything. No one believed us. They said it was our imagination. Thank God the beer had left our systems. But again, we were told to just knock it off and go to bed. Will and I stayed up all night talking about this, but no one came back, and we never saw those guys in robes again. I still don't know if it was just some dudes messing around or something more sinister. Either way, that really happened in a town known for creepy stuff happening. The Babysitter, submitted by Taryn. When I was about 10 years old, my regular babysitter could no longer watch me. I was an only child and my parents did a lot of stuff with me, but every once in a while they would go and do things on their own, so someone needed to watch me. My babysitter for a number of years was a teenager named Kelly who was awesome. She always made me popcorn and let me watch TV a little later than she was supposed to before I had to go to bed. Kelly always had games and was just a lot of fun, and I liked when she got to watch me. But when she was a senior in high school, she had to stop watching me because she had so much going on as she was graduating. My parents looked for a new babysitter for me and ended up picking a guy who was the son of one of my parents' friends. I'll call him Jack. Jack was also really cool. It was a little different having a guy watch me, a little girl, but he did a lot of the same things that Kelly did and always made me laugh. He also told me about a lot of rules that I never thought of in preparation of when I would be staying home alone. My parents had been talking about that, and he told me all about locking the doors and not answering the phone and stuff like that. He really did have an interest in my safety. But like anyone, he ended up making a mistake that was not so good. One Saturday night, my parents were going out and Jack was coming over at dinner time. He had a bunch of things planned for us, and I was excited to see him. We had dinner and watched some TV while playing Sorry. It came to bedtime, and he had me wash up, brush my teeth, and get into bed, and then let me read with my flashlight. He reminded me that he'd be right downstairs, and I just went to reading. I fell asleep and woke up in complete darkness. I didn't know what time it was, but for whatever reason, I just felt like something was wrong. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and looked around my bedroom and saw a dark shadow in the corner by my desk. At first I thought it was Jack and said, "Hey, what's going on?" But the shadow shape didn't do anything. I must have been really tired because I fell back asleep and woke up in the morning. My parents were making breakfast and I went downstairs and told them what I had seen the night before, and they told me it must have just been a dream. I figured they were right and forgot about it. The next time Jack had to babysit me, though, the same sort of events took place. I went to bed and woke up in the night, but this time the shadow was closer to my bed and was actually picking up the sheets at my feet. Immediately I thought I was still asleep again, but then the shadow figure moved, touched my leg and rubbed up my shin. Now I was scared but couldn't find my voice to yell, and in the dark, the shadow's hand kept creeping up my leg. I finally mustered a, "Leave me alone," but the shadow figure just searched me and kept moving its hand closer to the space between my legs and tummy. Now I really yelled out, and the figure backed up and then went out of my bedroom door and closed it. I was so scared I couldn't move. Finally I began yelling for Jack, but he didn't come right away. I got my courage up and went to my door and opened it, and there was nothing in the hallway. So I creeped downstairs and heard the front door open and closed, and then I heard the TV go on. I yelled out for Jack again and heard someone get up in my living room, and I ran downstairs. It was Jack, and he asked if everything was okay. I told him what had happened, and he got a strange look on his face. And he said, "Well, you're okay now. Why don't you just stay with me until you calm down?" He got me a glass of water, and I sat on the couch with him under a blanket as he asked me questions and tried to keep me calm. I eventually did calm down, and he took me back upstairs to my room to show me that no one was in there. Jack did seem a little off, though, and I do remember that even being so little. I went back to sleep and woke up the next day and told my parents that the shadow thing was in my room again. Once again, they said it was probably a dream, and I told them that Jack told me the same thing after he checked and there was nothing in there. The next time I needed a babysitter, Kelly had come back. I didn't really know why she was doing it, but I was super happy to see her. I asked my parents about Jack and where he'd gone, and they said that he wouldn't be able to see me or be my babysitter anymore. I didn't care. Kelly was awesome. I only had her as a babysitter for another year and then was left on my own when my parents went out, or I would go to a friend's house or whatever. When I was graduating from high school and getting ready to go to college, I asked my parents whatever happened to Jack. And they looked at each other and finally told me the truth. Jack had gotten into some trouble for assaulting a friend of his. He had beaten him so bad that Jack had to go to prison for teenagers for a little while. The 2 nights that things happened in my room were nights that Jack had made a bad decision to sneak out of my house to be with his girlfriend. He had asked a friend to fill in and just sit in the house living room to make sure that nothing happened while he was gone. But it did, because the guy had gone into my room and then done the things that he did. Thankfully, he didn't do anything more than touch my legs, but it could have been really, really bad. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was literally seconds away from being touched by an adult in my own bedroom. It made me sick to even think about it. That second night when I yelled for the shadow to leave, Jack was just coming back from seeing his girlfriend, and the guy had left. After I told Jack what had happened, Jack waited until the next day and confronted the guy, and when he found out it was true, he beat the living hell out of him. I think a tire iron was involved. Jack got arrested, and I never knew anything about it. When I look back, I was angry, and certainly at the time, too. I mean, I'd found out that Jack had done what he had done, knowing that he was just being a stupid guy and wanting to get laid. He had no idea that his friend was the way he was, and when he found out, obviously, he snapped. I've never heard or seen anything about Jack since then. Now that I have kids of my own, I am crazy vigilant about vetting their babysitters or anyone who's around my kids. Not because of Jack, but because of the people that Jack was friends with. Part of me is happy that Jack did what he did. I mean, sickos like that should not be left with kids, and while that was Jack's fault that it happened, I know in his heart he would never have wanted it to happen that way. Keep your family safe, and really check out anyone who's going to watch your kids. The Creepy Box, submitted by Anatole's First. In 2002, I moved from Houston, Texas, to a small town in Nebraska. I moved there to take over my uncle's painting business, as I was tired of the work I was doing and wanted to get out of Texas. I figured this was a good opportunity for me, as my uncle was ill and he had no one to take over, at least none of the guys on his crew he trusted. Both of my cousins had unfortunately passed away in a car accident earlier in my uncle's life. They were older than me, and I only saw them at family events, but my uncle and I, for whatever reason, had a good relationship after they were gone, and that was the genesis of me taking over his business. A couple of summers in high school and a couple more in college, I actually lived with him working on his crew. So there I was, on my own, in a town that I was not super familiar with, and certainly didn't know anyone. Leaving a city the size of Houston to an area like this certainly was a shock, but I did like it there. I mean, I still live there. Country living, ha ha ha. I had found a small house to rent on a pretty rural street. I didn't even meet my neighbors for the first couple of weeks. Most of them were farmers and obviously busy during the days. I was also busy trying to maintain clients for the paint company, as well as taking care of jobs that were outstanding. The only person still left on the crew was a guy named Roy, who was a really good guy. He was in his 30s, and his family often had me over for meals and over to small events or parties they were having. Good guy, still is. One fall afternoon, I came home from work and saw a box on my front porch. There was no postage or anything on it, just a label with my name. I figured maybe one of my neighbors had dropped it off and just picked it up and went inside. When I opened it later that evening, it was empty. There was nothing in there, but it had been taped shut all around. I thought it was odd, but didn't dwell on it for very long. I figured I would ask people if they had dropped something off and forgot to give me something whenever I saw them. A couple of days later, there was an envelope in my mailbox with no postage on it either. I opened it right away, and inside, in really bad, childlike handwriting, was 2 sentences. One said, "Bury the box to keep it away." The other sentence said, "I'm not kidding." To To this day, I have no idea what that meant or what was about to happen. I have zero explanations. This time, I did go for a drive to my 3 closest neighbors and asked them about the box, but I didn't bring up the envelope for the first 2. At my last visit, I did. My neighbor Chuck said he had no idea what that was supposed to mean. I laughed and said maybe my house is haunted, and he also laughed and said the only scary thing that ever happened in that house was the original owner's wife getting drunk, running out into the yard laughing, and naked while her husband chased her around with a garden hose. I went home feeling better about things with that laugh in my head, but when I pulled up in the dark to my porch, I saw another letter sticking out of my mailbox. I grabbed it and went inside and opened it. Again, no postage, and the weird writing said, "This is no joke. Bury the box." At this point, I was thinking someone was playing a joke on me, maybe even my neighbors, maybe even Roy. I called Roy and said, "Ha, funny joke," and told him, "Hey, I got your letters in the box." But there was silence on the phone. He said slowly, "I have no idea what you're talking about. That certainly isn't me playing a joke on you." That night I sat on my back porch, having a beer in what was now getting pretty chilly in the late fall night, and thought about the box and those letters. It shouldn't have been bothering me as much as it was, because it was awfully silly, but living alone and still being fairly new to the area, I was a little bothered that someone knew when I wasn't home and was having some fun or trying to scare me. The next day after work was a Friday, and I came home a little later after stopping at a bar for something to eat and a couple of beers. When I got home, it was around 8 or 8:30, and there was a bigger manila envelope propped up against my front door. No postage, same creepy feel. I opened it up on the porch, and there were a bunch of white letter-size envelopes inside, all saying the same thing in that weird handwriting. Most of them said, "Bury the box right now," and others saying, "You'll be sorry if you don't." At this point, I called the sheriff and told them what was going on, and they were pretty cool about sending someone over. I assured them that I didn't fear for my life or that kind of thing, but they said they wanted to take a look anyway. When they got out to my house, I had everything laid out on my coffee table and invited them in to take a look. There were 2 sheriffs, one older and one younger, and the younger one was completely disinterested and said, "Just throw this stuff out and don't worry about it." But the older one said, "Hang on a second." He lived in this area all his life and started to think if any strange people were around that would do this. I mean, every town, especially little towns, has the village idiot and the town crazy guy. He said he was going to follow up with them to make sure that they weren't driving all the way out into the country just to play a joke on me, but he wanted to make sure. They left saying that they would call me when they had more information or would stop back out. So later that night, I watched TV until I decided to hit the sack. And as I was getting ready for bed, I was looking out my back window onto the large yard that stopped at a group of trees. Not a forest, just a group of trees that kind of marked the end of the yard line. I swear I saw a dark shape out there in the moonlight. I went over to my closet and got my shotgun. I picked up a flashlight and in a fit of bravery went out into the yard to see if there really was someone out by the trees. When I got there, there wasn't anyone. But there was another envelope. It just had an X on it, and then that strange writing said, "Bury the box here. Bury it tonight. I can't protect you any longer." I stood there looking around and didn't hear or see anything. There was no way the shape that I saw could have gotten away in the moonlight and in that wide open area that surrounded my house. I got a very creepy feeling and went back inside and looked at the box still sitting on my coffee table. I debated back and forth for a while and finally decided, okay, screw this. Let's bury this damn box and see what happens. I mean, really at the worst of it, what could happen? Nothing. It was a bunch of silliness, but at least it might get whoever was doing this off my back. I took pictures of everything and then went out to my shed and got a spade. I walked back to the tree, and in the general vicinity of where I'd found the letter, I cut a huge square shape out of the sod. I figured I would do that and mark it so that if I came back and anything had happened to the box, I would know where it had been, and I would also be able to replace the turf easily. I dropped the box, still empty, into the hole, placed some dirt around it, and then topped it off with the chunk of sod that I had carefully cut out in the shape of a square. stood looking at it, feeling like a complete idiot, and then just went back inside. I fell asleep and had crazy dreams of being chased by a dark shadow all through the town of which I had moved to. I mean, you know how dreams are all scattered. I started off at my house, but suddenly was downtown and in front of a church. Whatever this thing was chasing me, but it would stop every time I stopped. I woke up in a sweat, and it was around 4:30 in the morning. The box rapidly came back into my head, and I figured, okay, screw this. I can't wait any longer. I'm going to go out and check on this damn box. I grabbed my shotgun, spade, and flashlight and went back to the trees. I looked for my mark and then carefully pulled up the turf. The box was still there, and I breathed a sigh of relief, but there was something dark red and sticky on top of it. I opened up the box after pulling it out, and it was heavy. There was something in there. Now I was pretty scared, and I pointed the flashlight down as I opened the box to find a very bloody deer heart. I almost dropped it, but I caught myself. I looked around and didn't see or hear anything, and now was really freaked out. I put the box back in the ground, reburied it with the turf, and then ran inside. I immediately called the sheriff and told them what had happened. It was not the same guy that I talked to, but they had obviously been talking about it at the station because he was familiar with what was up. He said he was calling the other sheriff and they would be out at first light. When they got there, I led them to the box, sheepishly telling them what I had done, and both of them had grins on their faces. For a second, I thought maybe they were in on this great joke, but their faces became grim when they pulled up the turf and looked at the box. The blood was still on the outside of it, but the heart had been removed. There was a bloody envelope in it, and the sheriff picked it up with a gloved hand. He opened it up, and in the same crazy handwriting were the words, "You are safe for now." And that about did it for me, and I said I didn't know what to do. The sheriffs took everything that had been at my house, and said they were going to have some forensic people look at it, but it would take some time as they were not equipped to do that in town. I didn't care. I just wanted that stuff out of my house and out of my life. I did register a complaint, but I knew that wasn't going to go anywhere. I didn't hear back from the sheriffs for about 2 weeks, and when they finally did call, they said there was nothing they could find. No fingerprints or anything like that. Nothing had been dropped off at my house, meanwhile, and I didn't get any more boxes or letters. I told them I was just going to chalk it up as to someone having fun at my expense. I stayed in that house for another 2 years and nothing happened. I eventually fell in love with a woman from the town, and we decided to get married and move to another home we were going to purchase. One night she was helping me pack up, as it would be my last night in the house before it was going to be rented to someone else. It was about 9:30 at night, and we were just finishing putting everything into my pickup truck as the movers had already taken everything else that I had owned to our new place. I was standing in the cool spring air having a beer with my soon-to-be wife, and she looked down and said, "Hey, what is that?" At the lowest step of my porch was an envelope. My heart went to the floor, and I went over and picked it up. The lettering on this one just said, "See, I told you I'd keep you safe." We decided to not stay there that night and went to her parents' house before we were getting the keys for our place the next day. Called the sheriffs and let them know what happened as sort of a follow-up, but even they kind of forgotten what had happened. I mean, it had been 2 years. We moved to our new house, and everything has been awesome since. I mean, nothing strange has happened here in the almost 20 years we've lived out here. All in all, I got a very strange scare out of this that I can share with my friends and family. I did ask my uncle if he had ever heard about anything like this stuff, but by this time the illness that had caused him to give me his business was taking its toll, but he did say he'd never heard anything like that before. I thought I'd share this story with you, not as freaky as other stories on your channel, but this one still sits with me because I still have no idea who was watching me or my house, and why they were doing what they were doing. They kept saying that they were protecting me, and maybe they were, but I much more would have appreciated someone just saying, "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood. We keep an eye on everyone here." To whoever who did what they did, I hope you got your jollies. I certainly didn't. Intruder Set Free by Lanny04. So this happened today a year ago. Keep in mind I live in South Africa, where the crime rate is high, but the area where I live is mostly safe. Brought up, I was always taught to keep doors and windows locked when home alone. I came home from writing an exam earlier that day and wanted to take a nap, so I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before taking my nap. Usually, if I took a nap, I left my door open in my bedroom, but on this specific day, I closed my door for some reason. While I was asleep, my body started shaking like I was having a panic attack, but in my sleep. And still half asleep, I started hearing noises in the house. I looked at my phone to see what time it was, since I thought maybe it was my parents who came home early. So I went out of my room, and as I turned left, there was a homeless guy rummaging through the closet of another room, the room right next to mine. Being still half asleep and witnessing a literal burglary, my mind went blank. The guy came up to me and put a knife against my throat, demanding me to give him money or he'd kill me. I was crying hysterically and begging him not to hurt me. He saw my phone in my pocket and demanded me to give it to him. I went from being scared to mad, and I refused to give him my phone. I know I should have probably just given it to him, but this was the only expensive thing I ever had, and knew my parents couldn't afford to get me a new one. I started fighting back, and the more I refused to give my phone, the more he started pushing me, and I ended up in the bathroom right across from my room. He pushed me into the bathtub and got over me, and right in that moment, I thought it would be the end of me. And then I yelled at him that I already called the police and that they were on their way. That wasn't true. After I said that, though, he closed the bathroom door and ran off. Then I called the police and my parents. The police came and found the knife he had held against my neck outside the house and discovered that he had broken the door down. And that's how he got in. In April this year, 5 months after the incident, they found the guy and saw that he had been put in jail for burglary over 10 times, but every time they let him out after a few months, which is typical in South Africa. But in my instance was the first instance he was charged for attempted murder. I was going to go to court to give my testimony, but the police said the chances of him going to jail for a few years were slim, and I was going to just be wasting my time by testifying. We tried to argue that he should go to jail, but it didn't help. He was released despite his charges. Later on, we found out his brother is a policeman, and that's most likely how he was always getting away with everything. I can't sleep at night knowing he's been released, and if that was the situation that his brother did help him by getting out, he now has all my information, and of course knows where I live. I hope I never encounter him again. That's Not My Friend in the Woods by Bossy Boots 801. I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street 10 or so miles from a town. There were 7 houses in the area spread out on 2.5-acre wooded lots or larger. There were no large wild animals like bears, and people didn't meander around out there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years I lived there. Please keep that in mind. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door, Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open it, and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway, and I'd often know if he was out. The light would be on over the side to our entrance, or if he was home, the light was off. One time during the summer when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of the car and was talking to his friends, and soon they pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond, and I guess he probably didn't hear me. Then I came up with the not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent, and as kids we'd often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door. That led to our backyard below my window, which led to Terry's house off to the side. I had to go through the gravel area and then through a well-worn path through the woods, about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven stepping path in the gravel, and if you stepped off the rounds, the crunch of gravel or rocks would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark, and I didn't see him. And also, at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do him. Then I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods slowly, and pausing every once in a while like me. It was coming closer, and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly towards my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still startle him. I still thought it was Terry, and that he saw me sneak out, and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening, checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered for Terry after losing patience one last time, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so quietly I tippy-toed back to my garage door and went back inside, silently locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I'd just been standing and crouching. My window was open, and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window, but got no answer. Then I heard something or someone fall and grunt or moan pretty loudly in the window well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you're not familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. We'd been playing hide-and-seek in many outdoor games for years since we were young around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells and house footprints, plus the paths in the woods, just like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded human and not like an animal. Whatever it was, it also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game, and someone or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out. I couldn't lean my head out of the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks. Whatever was walking around was stepping in the noisy gravel. Again, Terry would have known where the log rounds were, and would not have stepped in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped, and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen 2 stories up for probably half an hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm sure I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. I never heard it, him, or her leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. 1, it wasn't Terry. I asked him later, and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He would have no reason to lie. 2, I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors, and I can't think of any reason why a person would be out there. We had few neighbors, and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out in 2.5+ acres per home. 3, there weren't any big animals in the area. As wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to homes. Plus our dogs scared them away. Whatever was out there, stranger in the woods, let's not ever meet. Something in the Basement, submitted by Autumn K. I want to start this story out by explaining the layout of my house in which this situation happened. When you go into the house, you come into the living room. Then from there to the right are two staircases, one going upstairs to the bedrooms and one going downstairs to the basement. If you go forward a bit, there's the kitchen. In the basement, there's part of it that goes outside to a covered patio. My parents stayed in the basement because it was easier to get in and out, as my dad was disabled at the time. I was sitting in a chair in the living room facing the staircases. I was either watching something on YouTube or watching something for school. Either way, I had one headphone in while listening to something. I was home alone this day, and at the time, we didn't have any pets. I was really into whatever it was that I was doing, but all of a sudden I heard what sounded like something crashing in the basement, like someone knocked over or bumped into a stack of boxes. I didn't think anything of it at the time, just thinking that my parents were probably home. I walked over to the basement and opened the door to call out for my parents, but no lights were on and nobody responded. I thought it was odd, but maybe I was just hearing something. I thought it could have been a noise from what I was watching, so I went back to my computer and went back a bit on the video. There was nothing there that sounded like what I had heard. But to make myself feel better, I just told myself that I was hearing something. I went back to my video, and about 10 minutes or so later, I heard a similar noise. This time I was feeling quite nervous, but still, I told myself that it was nothing, probably just an animal or my imagination. I texted my mom and asked her if they were home, and she said no. I tried to get the courage to go down there. However, I was very scared of the basement to begin with, so when I heard a strange noise down there was no chance of convincing myself to investigate. I did go outside to check if my parents' car was there, but it wasn't. My mom was telling the truth. I tried my best to ignore the noise again, and nothing happened for about 20 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, I heard what sounded like a grown man running up the stairs. At this point, I started to cry because I didn't know what was in there. I ran outside the front door and called my mom, and I explained everything that had happened, and she said that they were almost home. I stayed outside until my parents got home. My grandpa almost got home at the same time, and I told them all what happened again, and we all went downstairs to the basement together. But nothing was there. There wasn't even a mess on the ground that I had expected to see after all of the crashing that I heard. My family told me that it was probably a wild animal or something, but I'm not convinced. The noise of whatever it was running up the staircase was definitely not an animal. I haven't really had any experience like that since. My grandpa still lives in that house, and he hasn't experienced anything either. Faces in the Snow, submitted by Terrence. When I was in my early 20s, I took a job working on an oil rig in Manitoba, Canada. The pay was really good, but the job was certainly not easy. Even in good weather during the spring and summer months, it took a lot out of me, especially being the rookie, made to do all the shit no one else wanted to do. It's to be expected in that line of work, and I'm not complaining. I did learn a lot. I almost didn't get a job for the winter, as those jobs fill up pretty fast as far as the ranks for the older season's vets go, and there wasn't as much to do as there were in the spring and summer months. But a couple of guys decided to take jobs elsewhere, and one became available to me. I jumped at the chance, knowing how difficult it was going to be, with the weather and the temperatures, and the shifts were pretty solid, though. We were working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and living in this little hut not too far from one of the rigs we were assigned. The hut was a bare-bones structure, and it didn't really play into the story. Well, sort of it does. I'll describe it anyway. There was a wood-burning stove, a table and chairs, 3 bunks, a sink with no running water, a TV, and a PlayStation. Bare bones for sure. But it was always warm, with one person always being there to keep the fire going, while the other 2 worked 10-hour shifts. In the winter, it can drop to minus 40 Celsius, and when you add in the 65 kilometers per hour winds, the wind chill can be close to minus 70. Basically, the longer you're outside, the longer you expose yourself to frostbite, hypothermia, and quite frankly, death. My two partners, I will call them Mark and Joe, and I would work out of a truck. The truck was kept in a small enclosure next to our hut, and some of the heat was pumped out there to keep the engine warm. With a frozen engine, nothing would happen on the job, so that was always a focus to make sure the diesel would turn over. Two of us in 10-hour shifts would go out in the truck to the rig. While one person did a set of tasks on the rig, the other stayed inside the cab of the truck, staying warm. After about 10 or 15 minutes, you had to switch up and the other person got warm. It was that brutal. I mean, if you fuck around in weather like that, you can end up dead pretty quick. The good news was that usually every other day was an off day, so we weren't constantly out in the elements. That wasn't always the case, but it did happen. One of us would always have to double up on a shift, so those days could actually be 20 to 22 hours long. Yeah, so much for the 10-hour shifts in the brochure. Okay, so here's what happened that really messed with our heads. One morning, Joe and I were out doing our thing at the rig. It's tiring and boring work, and again, added to the feeling of isolation with crazy weather, really doesn't help your state of mind. I will say this, when this happened, we were both completely coherent, very warm, and not in any bad state of health. It was about 6 a.m. and we were just starting the day. We had to work during the day, as going out at night was a really bad idea with the temperatures. Unless there was an emergency at the rig, we worked around 6 to 6. It was January, and the sun usually got up around 8 and set closer to 5. Some of the time we got paid for was traveling back and forth to the hut and other paperwork we had to file once we had completed our shifts. I do remember that we were working a 12-hour shift that day. It must have been some decision that had been made above us. But we knew that we had to do it, and then have time to just rest and eat and play some video games in that downtime. When we got there, I got out of the truck in the dark and went over to the rig. And this was not a very fun day, as the winds were really whipping the snow around, and I could barely see 4 or 5 feet in front of me. Only when I got up to the rig did the headlamp seem to do anything, so I could get my job going. I remember I was having an issue with something and getting very frustrated, and knew that in my short amount of time I was not going to complete my task, and would have to ask Joe to take over for that. That was something that was very irritating to everybody on the job. You were expected to do what you were supposed to do and not have to pass off things to your partner. Well, we got along okay, I'm not saying we didn't, but it just made the job that much more tough. So I was yelling into the wind how frustrated I was, and I stopped for a second to make sure that I was doing everything correctly and to procedure. I took a step back and looked into the nothingness around me, when suddenly I saw a dark shape in the whiteness of the blowing snow. It got darker, and at first I thought I was hallucinating. The shape got darker and darker until it became human shapes. There were people out here. My brain kind of stuttered, and I couldn't imagine, number one, how the hell anyone had gotten out this far in this weather, and number two, how the hell they were surviving. There were 3 of them, and they were all bundled up in heavy Inuit parkas, at least the style that they wore. Huge warm pants with very large coats with fur around the face area. But what got to me was they weren't wearing any face coverings. We, of course, had extremely warm balaclavas and state-of-the-art gear to keep us warm while we were out there. But here I was, looking into the face of 3 people, their faces looking very tan or dark, just like the Inuit. They were wearing nothing on their faces. As I stood there staring, one of them just pointed to something on the rig and smiled. I turned to see what he was pointing at and realized it was something that I had to adjust, and that's why I was having trouble. When I turned to look at them again, they were retreating, walking backwards into the wind and into the blank whiteness of snow. I stood there dumbfounded until my brain kicked in and said, "Take care of this rig and get back to the truck." I completed my task and then stumbled back towards the truck using my compass. I mean, we were only parked about 20 or 30 yards from the rig, but in the snow and the blowing wind, you couldn't see shit even though the lights of the truck were on. As I saw the lights in the snow, I breathed a sigh of relief and climbed into the truck. I sat there for a minute while Joe was getting his stuff to get out and go do what he had to do, when he turned to me and asked if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I was just struggling to get my shit done. That's what took me an extra couple of minutes." He said I didn't look good, and I said I was just tired. And he nodded, took a big swig of his coffee, pulled up his balaclava and got his gloves and cinched the hood. He was headed out for his work. My mind was swirling, thinking about what I had seen. I mean, maybe I really hadn't seen anything. Maybe it was just something my brain had made up. Maybe in my frustration, my imagination took over and brought me back to the reality of what I had to do for my job. But it seemed so real. I spent the next few minutes jotting down the progress of our work and then sat back for some coffee, myself, waiting for my next round out at the rig. I looked at the clock in the truck and realized Joe was gone a little bit longer than he should have been. But I wasn't panicking. I figured maybe he was having the same kind of difficulty I was. Thankfully, in the next couple of minutes, I saw him loom out of the whiteness in the truck lights. He got in and sat there for a second, and now it was my turn to ask him if he was okay. He pulled his balaclava down and took a sip of coffee and looked at me, but didn't say anything. After a second, he said, "Everything's fine." He was also struggling with his task, but he got it done. We sat in silence for another minute or two as I was getting ready to go back out, when I said, "Can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure," as he just stared out the windshield into the nothingness around us. "Look, man, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I swear to God, I think I saw people out there." He didn't say anything for a few seconds and looked me dead in the eye and said, "Yeah, so did I. We both described what we had seen, and it was the same thing. 3 people dressed in white winter clothing with no face coverings coming out of the gloom near the rig." I told him that they had pointed towards something that I was messing up, and he nodded and said the same thing. We were completely freaked out at this point, and neither of us wanted to go back out there, even though these people or whatever, they didn't seem like they were going to attack us or anything crazy like you hear on some of these stories on the horror channels. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as you'll hear. I said, "Well, I better get back out there," and he said, "Look, man, be careful." We always told each other to be careful, but for some reason this time it sounded a little different. Again, neither of us wanted to go out there. I got geared up and stumbled back towards the rig for my next task, but didn't get started right away, and looked all around me wondering if these people or whatever they were coming back. I got my task done and started to get ready to go back to the truck, and as I was walking towards it looking for the wind-blown footprints in the snow, I picked my head up and stopped. The 3 figures were now standing between me and the truck. Their faces did not look as happy as they did before. Now they looked kind of angry. I stood there looking into their eyes, and eventually they made a turn and again walked backwards into the wind and disappeared. I basically ran back to the truck and jumped inside and told Joe what I had just seen. I said the first time they looked happy, but this time they didn't. He didn't say anything and didn't really know what to do, neither did I. He got ready for his time out there again. This time I was the one to tell him to be careful. Something was not right out there, and I said if you see them again, maybe we should radio it in. Joe didn't say anything in response and went outside. I was now very bothered. I kept tapping the radio, wondering if I should call in, but being the rookie, I was not making a move. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy, and I certainly didn't want to jump over the chain of command. Joe had been doing this for a lot longer than me, and I was following his lead on pretty much everything. He got back after his time out in the weather and sat in the truck. I knew it was only a matter of minutes before I had to go back out there. But this time, Joe touched my arm with his glove and said, "Hang on a few minutes." I asked what had happened, if he had seen those things again, and he nodded. He said that one of them was trying to say something to him, basically yelling into the wind with no sound coming out, but he gathered that they were not happy with us being out there. Of course, this scared me even more, and I was really afraid to go back out. And I said, "Man, maybe we should radio this in." And Joe shook his head and said, "No way, man, they'll think we're crazy." I could tell he was coming up with some reason for us to shut it down for the day and go back to the hut. After a few minutes, I got myself together and went back outside. And by now it was getting a little bit lighter out. Like a little kid, I thought maybe in the daytime these things wouldn't come out, and they only came out when it was dark. Don't ask me where I got that from, it was just stuck in my head. I started off towards the rig, now being able to see it a little bit more in the growing light. But before I could get up to it, I saw the 3 figures run about 8 feet in front of me into the wind. They ran right out in front of me between me and the rig, and I stopped terrified in my tracks. After a moment, I moved forward and noticed they had left no footprints. I basically ran to the rig, got my stuff done, only thinking about getting back to the truck and to Joe. I did my task and ran back to the truck without seeing them again, and I told Joe what happened, and then I noticed they weren't leaving any footprints. Clearly we were seeing something, but we had no idea what it was. I mean, they couldn't be human. They weren't leaving any fucking footprints. Joe again sat quietly and then got his stuff on to go back outside and said he was thinking about something, and after he finished we would talk about what was going on and what we should do. And just as he turned for the door, he stopped. Right outside the truck door, on his side, stood the 3 figures. They were all looking in at us, and their faces were now not just looking angry. I mean, we could see the anger and the fire in their eyes as they looked at us. I gave out a yell when I saw that they were that close, and Joel told me to shut the fuck up. He started to open the door, and that's when we heard and saw them open their mouths and start this unbelievably loud, low bass-like moan. Joe immediately shut the door, and the 3 figures backed up away from the truck, out of sight. That was it. Joe picked up the radio and called the hut, first to talk to Mark, then got headquarters on and said there was an issue out there with our rig. Our foreman asked what was going on, and we gave him the appraisal of what we had accomplished so far. And then after a long pause, Joe told him about these figures we kept seeing. The foreman's name was Trask, and Trask basically said, "Yeah, you guys are a little crazy. Maybe you just need some rest." He said there was no way in hell anyone could be out there, and no one could survive even if they were. But he didn't sound like he was accusing us of anything. I mean, honestly, it sounded like he was saying it because someone else was either near him where he was, or maybe it was just someone else in his office. We asked him to advise us, and he said finish up 3 more tasks apiece, and that would be enough for the day. After a moment of silence, he radioed back and said, "Just be safe and get back to the hut." We could barely hear him say that. So we did as we were told, and in those 6 tasks, we only saw the figures twice again. Both times they were near the truck. By now it was light enough outside that the whiteness of the dark was now just totally white. I hope that makes sense. Joe took the wheel and got us back to the hut, and we immediately made sure the truck was parked properly, and then we went inside to the warmth. Mark was sitting there drinking coffee and watching a DVD. He looked at us, and right away we realized he had been listening to the radio in our transmission with headquarters. He said, "What did you guys see out there?" We told him, and he said he didn't think we were crazy. He actually thought he had been going crazy. We asked him why, and he said that repeatedly while we were out at the rig, someone had been coming up and pounding on the door of the hut. But every time he opened it, he could only hear a weird moan and see 3 figures standing just out of reach of his flashlight. He didn't say anything with as much detail as we could with what we saw, but he said it was definitely 3 human figures. As a matter of fact, he said it looked like that scene from Star Trek II when the guys land on that planet that has the sandstorm going on. Just these shapes that came out of nowhere. A little while later, we got a call on the radio. It was Trask. He asked how we were doing, and we told him about what Mark had seen, too. He said, "Hang on for a second." We could tell he was either getting someone away from him, or he was getting away from where he was. He again asked if we were okay, and told us that he believed us about what we had seen. He had seen the same sort of thing years earlier when he worked out there with his partner at the time. He told us that we were taking a day off early, and we were going to take the next day off as scheduled. He was going to send another crew of guys our way. We asked him what was going on, and he said, "All I can tell you is that you're not to go out of the hut." He said to just take it easy and everything would be fine. He was right. We took the rest of that day and the next day off, and all just tried to relax, catch up on sleep, and take care of the things we had to take care of around the hut. The storm that we'd been experiencing had calmed down, and on that next day we could hear footsteps coming towards the hut. For some reason we never heard the truck, but it was 3 of our buddies coming out, as Trask had said. Trask was with them, and after he sent the 3 guys to go out and look at the rig and make sure everything was okay after a day of not being attended to, he looked at us and said, "Don't tell anyone else about what you guys saw." He wasn't kidding. He then said, "I know because, as I mentioned, I saw them, but what I'm about to tell you doesn't go any farther than this." In the time that he had seen them, he and his partner had not been as chicken shit as me and Joe. They repeatedly attempted to talk to the figures to the point where his partner got a shotgun out of the truck. We all had shotguns in the trucks. And his partner had followed or tried to follow the figures into the snowstorm they were experiencing. Trask leaned towards us and said, "The last I heard was 2 shots from that shotgun, and I never saw my partner again." We couldn't find his body. After the storm lightened up, we took 3 days and countless kilometers in every direction, but we never found his body. The company kept everything hush-hush, and that's when I was promoted. Don't bring this up to anyone. It's not supposed to have happened. My partner had no family, and no one ever knew what happened to him. All I know is that no one has reported those figures until now. And I know in my heart of hearts, if you guys had stayed working out there, you might have gone down the road my partner went down. Then he stood up and followed the other guys out to the rig. That was it. That was the explanation we got. We never heard anything else about this, and we never looked into anything else either, and nothing else happened for the rest of that winter. I eventually got out of that end of the business, and I now work on the corporate side in the finance department. From time to time, I do have to interact with the roughers, and every time I do, I think about my time out there. No one's ever mentioned anything like that to me again. Trask is now dead, and I lost track of Joe over the years. I have no idea what happened to him, and I'm sure it's just life moving us apart, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I wonder if he's seen what I have in the quiet of my neighborhood. I never saw those figures on the job again, but I have seen them in my home life. Sometimes in my backyard, sometimes way off in the distance on a hunting trip, and I wonder if Joe has seen them too. But I wonder if Joe is not as smart as me. I mean, I never went after them. I'd like to think Joe hasn't either, but who knows? The story is completely legit, and I'm sure I'm speculating about Joe. I mean, for all I know, he's fine and living his best life wherever he is. It's been a while since I've seen those figures, and I don't know who they are or what they mean, but I am convinced that they are some kind of harbinger of something bad, and I avoid them whenever I do see them. No one in my family has seen them, including my wife and 4 kids. I don't talk about it much, but I thought I would share my story with you and your listeners. Thanks. Something in the Sky, submitted by CB. My family and I were traveling back to the East Coast from the Rockies a few years ago. I wasn't the only person to see what we saw. It was myself, my wife, her sister, and all of us were 20-something adults, and my kids, aged 2 and 9, were there at the time. The route we opted to take home was the northern route through Peoria, Illinois. It was dark as we came into Peoria, probably around 9 p.m., the same week as the 4th of July. I think it was 2016. We were behind the times and using an older model Garmin GPS unit rather than the now more common smartphone. As we were coming across a bridge over a river, I saw this arrangement of orangish, white lights in a triangular formation. I know it was an odd number of lights as there was a point in the front and equally spaced lights following behind the point, forming the shape of a chevron. It was either 5 or 7, I don't recall now. The lights were fairly large and easily visible, but didn't seem to create any ambient light. As we were driving eastward, this object entered my sight high on my left from the north headed south, and then to my upper right. At about the time it was mid-windshield in our sights, the lights turned point side down as if it were a plane and the tail end went over the front. We all thought for certain it was a plane about to crash, and we braced for the impact off to our right, but nothing ever happened, and our GPS unit went haywire. We got our phones out to try and take pictures, but even they were cut off. I restarted my phone much too late to use it, but it was still functional. The GPS, though, was toasted. It would still light up and show the little icon, but it wasn't on any roads on the map. It appeared that we were just driving through open fields on the GPS, from there all the way home. Online, I've seen similar images of what we saw out there, but I don't know. We never did figure out what it was. A cautionary tale, submitted by Anonymous. I'm a 21-year-old female, but this story starts when I was 16. I will stay anonymous for this because of the legal things involved. At the time, I was a sophomore in high school, and I had transferred from an advanced course to the standard equivalent due to mental health issues. My new class, which I started towards the end of the school year, was taught by a student teacher. I had a total of 2 conversations, if you can call them conversations, with this man while he was my teacher, and I never even bothered to learn his name. The first conversation we had consisted of him asking why I had switched courses and me answering honestly that the stress of the harder course along with my current struggles with depression and an eating disorder was just too much. Weeks later, we had our second conversation. He held me back after class to tell me that he had graded our exam. He had removed the questions I had gotten wrong, and he claimed that if I had gotten the questions wrong, it must have been a poorly written question. Looking back on this as an adult, I can see the red flag that was there. But as a suicidal 16-year-old, I just took it as a compliment and smiled and walked away. His student teaching placement at my high school ended. I gave him a goodbye present because I felt bad that our class had been assholes to him the entire time he was at our school. It was just a kind gesture, and I figured I'd never see or hear from him again. I mean, he was nothing special. But little did I know that he would brainwash me into thinking otherwise. I hate to give away the point of this story, but it needs to be said before anyone has the chance to romanticize this. If you take anything away from this story, take away this. Kids and teens, that older person that gives you special attention or says you're mature for your age or that age is just a number, that person's a predator. No matter how wonderful of a minor you are, you're a minor, and that adult should not be interested in you. And for God's sake, do not trust a person who demands your relationship to be a complete and utter secret. Anyway, I digress. I was doing schoolwork later that day, his last day, and I got a notification that someone had requested to be my friend on Snapchat. I accepted the request, and there was a message from the account thanking me for the gift. Connecting the dots, I responded, apologizing again for how the students had treated him. He thanked me again for treating him well and let me know that he timed his lectures based on how fast I took notes. Again, red flag. But I was in such a bad place in life that I was enjoying the idea of being special. He was 22 years old, a nearly 7-year gap between us. We began talking non-stop, but not without him making me promise to keep my relationship with him a secret. He told me he loved me, that I was his soulmate. I'd never felt happier. I watched his college graduation online instead of in person since he wouldn't let me meet his family or friends, for obvious reasons. He had a live-in girlfriend who he eventually claimed to have broken up with, for me. There is so much I could say about a relationship, but I'll try to keep it to the main points. I found out that he got my social media information by going through his supervisor's computer to find my full name and address, and then internet stalking me. I was so brainwashed by his grooming that I found that endearing rather than scary and creepy. He lived over an hour away, so he looked for apartments near my house. He said he'd follow me to college. He made me meet up with him in places where no one knew we would be. He spoke to me the way he spoke to his dog. He guilted me into sending nudes and having phone sex with him. He hit me, he molested me, and he raped me. I froze and couldn't defend myself like I would have liked to. I was in broad daylight in a public place, in my car, in a jumpsuit. I'm adding those details to show how it does not matter what you do. The assaulter is completely to blame, not the victim. After he raped me, he immediately flipped the script. He started crying about how he was so damaged and worthless. Also crying, I told him to get out of my car. He did and watched me drive off. That drive home was the first time I seriously considered ending my life. I was so brainwashed that I convinced myself that everything was fine and nothing bad happened to me. I repressed those memories. It took 2 years for the memories to resurface and for me to get the guts to report him to the police. I'd realized that what he did was criminal, but he still had such a hold on me that I didn't want to break my promise to him, that I wouldn't tell. But I had to. I had to make sure that he never did this again to another kid. The police investigation didn't start for another 2 years, and this was due to how many sex crimes against children there were already backed up in my district, which is horrifying on its own. He was not sentenced for another year after that, and his lawyer played dirty. The case would have taken much longer if he had not accepted a deal. He ended up with no jail time, but is a registered sex offender for life, and had his license to teach revoked. There's also a restraining order in place ordering him to stay away from me and have no contact with me or my family. Grooming is a scary thing that you don't even realize is happening. I still fight my guilt for getting him arrested, but with therapy, I've gotten much better and will continue to work on it. Everybody, please be vigilant. Keep an eye on your friends and children. Urbex Jerks, submitted by Brian D. A couple of years back, my friends and I decided to do a little urban exploring in a town about an hour away from us. You may have heard of it. It's called Centralia, Pennsylvania. A while back, a fire started, and no one really knows how it happened, but it happened in the mine underground that basically runs under the entire town. The fire is still burning, and it's a very dangerous place to go. And I will tell you that we did see law enforcement out there. It was a completely abandoned town. All the buildings were still standing, but completely derelict. There were businesses as well as homes. The entire town basically just up and moved. Some people, I guess, stayed for as long as they could, but as far as I know, even they're gone now. Some of the roads are all busted up due to the fire and the way that the ground shifts. It's really a sight to see. You can find pictures of it if you Google it right now. Anyway, we decided to see if we could sneak around a little bit towards dusk, hoping there wouldn't be any local police to chase us out. We even parked a ways up the main drag and walked down so as to not arouse any suspicion. When we got into town, we spent a lot of time taking pictures of everything that we could while dodging anyone we thought might yell at us and tell us to leave. We got to an empty home with an open back door, and were shocked to see another group of people already in the house. They were out doing the same thing we were, just the Urban X stuff. There were 3 of us and 4 of them, all males on our side, and 3 guys and 1 girl on theirs. We all exchanged names and talked about why we were there and other places that we had checked out. They seemed really cool, and we decided to explore the house together. My friend Andy and I decided to start looking at things in the basement. Most of the things of the family who lived there were gone, but there were still odds and ends here and there. Some pretty creepy stuff that you can see in the pictures on the internet. Old stuffed animals, toys, just a general mess. When we went down the rickety stairs to the basement, we noticed that it was hotter down there. I'm going to stop here and say I do not suggest anyone go to Centralia, nor do I endorse what we were doing. It's not the safest of things to do, especially with the levels of carbon monoxide and other stuff in the air. We were just being dumb and decided to go down anyway. After a few minutes, our other friend Scott came down with us, and we were just going through some old tools and taking pictures of the mess in the basement. We heard the other people walking around upstairs and talking, and thought we should go up there because it was pretty sketchy in the basement, and there wasn't really much to see anyway. When we all turned around to head back to the staircase, we heard the door at the top of the stairs close. Then we heard footsteps moving quickly out of the kitchen area where the door to the basement was. We went up the stairs and found that the door was locked. It was hung towards us, and we couldn't get it to budge. All 3 of us took turns trying to do it, and yelling to the other people to open the fucking door. We were met with silence. We had nothing but our flashlights, and anger took over pretty quickly. We did our best to try to kick out the door, but that didn't do anything. It didn't work at all. We kept yelling for the others, but soon realized they were no longer in the house. Why the hell they closed the door on us is a mystery that remains to this day. Not only was that not cool, it was unbelievably dangerous, and had we not found a basement window that had been covered, we would have been stuck down there. We were unbelievably mad after trying to open the door, and when Scott went back downstairs and discovered the window, he yelled for us. We all got down there, stacked up some boxes to get to the window, which opened freely. It didn't take long for all three of us to scramble out of the window into the whatever kind of fresh air is out there, and we looked around to see where those other people had gone. There was no sign of them. We were really pissed at this point and determined to walk around and try to find them. We figured it would be a fair fight with 3 guys on 3 guys. But after about 45 minutes of wandering around, we couldn't find them and decided we should probably just get the hell out of there. Wackos that would do something like that to strangers probably were capable of doing a lot more once it got dark. We kept taking pictures on our way out of town, and it was getting darker quicker. When we were within eyeshot of our car, I saw 2 people standing near it and immediately pointed it out to my friends. It was clear whoever it was trying to get in, so we broke into a run to catch them. As we got closer, we noticed that 2 of the guys were 2 of the same that were in the house with us, and I yelled something like, "Get the fuck away from my car!" And that's when they made a run for it into the brush on the side of the road. When we got to my car, I was ready to go find the guys and lay down some ass whooping. But my friends called me out and told me we really just needed to get in the car and get the heck on the road. So that's what we did. We just got out of there until we realized we were driving the wrong way. I did a U-turn and went back the way we had come, and as we were going through the main intersection of town, I looked up the cross street and saw all 4 of them standing on the side of the road. Without asking my friends, I turned the car straight at them and hit the gas. I remember hearing the girl scream and the guys yell as I barreled down onto them, swerving at just the last minute. They all fell backwards as I started to turn around for another pass, with my friends screaming at me to cut it out. But I will be honest, they were laughing at the same time. As I made another pass, all 4 of them ran behind some buildings, and I just kept going. I figured, hey, they gave us a scare, I gave them a scare. Now it was even, and time to go home. And again, I don't suggest anyone going out there or going into any of the buildings. We were really stupid for doing what we did, and not just because of those people. You can get seriously hurt out there. There's sinkholes, and again, the fire is still burning. You can see the smoke coming up from the ground in a lot of places. If you do go, I suggest staying above ground and taking pictures of that smoke. If any of those people hear this, you're a bunch of assholes, and part of me wishes I had clipped 1 or 2 of you with my car just to get even. But I didn't, and you should feel lucky you got away with nothing. People like that give urban exploration a bad name. Hey, whoever you are, go fuck yourselves. Turn of events, submitted by Tyler. When I was growing up, we had this really cranky old man for a neighbor. The kind of guy who yelled at kids and everybody else if you so much as put a foot on his front lawn walking by. He was mean as a snake, to everybody, including my parents and anyone else in the neighborhood. If we were playing in our yard or street hockey, and he happened to be coming by in his car, he would lay on the horn super loud, even a couple of houses past where we were playing. It's not like he was letting us know he was coming for safety. He was just being a jerk, and we always saw him coming anyway. He was constantly complaining to the town and calling the police on everything and anything anyone did in the neighborhood. He would even complain about people's Christmas lights, people trick-or-treating on Halloween, and God forbid you try to cut the grass when he didn't think you should. He was just all around mean, a mean old man. One day I was home alone. My parents and sisters were out doing something that I didn't feel like doing. I don't remember exactly, it doesn't matter. It could have been any number of a dozen things I wanted nothing to do with as a young male. I saw it as a chance to play video games and chill out with the house to myself. My dog was with me in my bedroom as I was playing away, and I thought I heard a noise downstairs, so I went to check it out, seeing if my parents and sisters came home. But no one was there. I went back upstairs after grabbing a soda and kept playing, and then heard something else. I did hear somebody walking around downstairs. That's when I started to get nervous. I texted my dad, and he said that they were still out, and I told him I thought someone was in the house. He said it was probably just my imagination. That's when I heard a crash in my kitchen and the sound of someone scrambling about. I heard someone messing with my back door and another struggle as I walked down there, and a voice yelled out, "Stop! Get on the ground!" The voice sounded familiar. I ran downstairs with my phone ready to call 911 and looked out into my back deck. My dog was right by my side, and what I saw surprised me. The old man from next door was standing on my back deck with a shotgun in his hand, and a really scraggly-looking guy lying face down on the deck. I called 911 immediately before opening the back door, and I told the police what was going on. They said they would send someone right over and to stay on the line. I told them about the guy next door holding a really creepy-looking guy at gunpoint, and they said stay inside. Of course, what did I do? I opened the door, and the old man told me to call 911. I told him that I had, and he was out there with his shotgun. He gruffly said thanks, and kept watching over the guy who once in a while would try to get up, and the old man would yell out, "Get back down!" The police arrived, and I told them to come around the side of the house over the phone, and the dispatcher relayed the information. They did, and yelled to my neighbor to put the gun down and back up, and immediately came over and handcuffed the creepy guy. Upon questioning, the old man said that he was out in his yard and saw this guy crawling through our dog door. He was a pretty big guy, and I can't believe he got through the dog door. Once he got inside, he'd been rummaging around in the house while I was upstairs, unbeknownst to me. He had grabbed a couple of things that were in his pockets. While he was walking around, he knocked over a crystal dish in my kitchen, and then scrambled back out through the dog door. Why he didn't just open it, I'll never know. But it didn't matter. He ran right into the waiting shotgun of my cranky old neighbor. The police hauled the guy off and thanked the old man. Then they told me to call my parents and tell them to come home immediately. I did, and when they got there, the police continued to talk to my parents while I was still shaking. The old man actually cracked a smile about how scared I was. Before the police told him he could go home, he looked at me and told me to be more alert when I was home by myself. He actually patted me on the shoulder, something I never thought he would do in a million years. It was amazing that for all that jerky stuff he did in the neighborhood, he turned out to be a really good guy when it mattered most. Sadly, he passed away 7 months after this happened. Over that time, we learned he was a Vietnam vet who was struggling with PTSD, and that's why he really was the way he was. Looking back, I thank my lucky stars that he was paying attention to our house, when he was, and for helping me stop this creepy guy. Not like I had anything to do with it. It goes to show that you never know what the chapters of a book hold until you actually read it. I didn't stay home alone for a long time after that, but I did forge a relationship with the old man for the last few days of his life. I'll never forget him saving me and showing me that he really was a nice guy despite his behavior in the neighborhood. Somehow that moment of goodness and kindness changed him. He never called the cops or complained about anything again before he passed. Wherever he is, I can't thank him enough for watching out for me. The Night Bus Stalker by Kate. This happened around the summer of 2022 after I met up with 2 performer friends to rehearse for an upcoming show. I was catching the night bus to get back to the subway station where my car was, as I took the train while it was still operating. I was already uneasy, as I am a femme-presenting individual. I was born a female. I had no money to get a taxi or Lyft at the time. The bus finally came around, so I got on, paid the $2 bus fare, and sat down. The rest of the ride was pretty uneventful, as everyone was keeping to themselves. Pretty soon the bus began to empty out as people got off at their stations, where it was me and this one man who was giving me some weird vibe. I caught him looking at me a few times out of nowhere during the bus ride, but now he was asleep. I prayed that he would not get off at the same time as me, but unfortunately, That's exactly what happened once we finally got to my stop. When I began walking towards my car, I looked behind me to find the man following me. He was keeping a bit of distance from me, but I was still paranoid that he was 100% following me. I began to pick up the pace, getting my keys out while also clutching onto a pocket knife my roommate gave to me for protection. As soon as I reached my car, I jumped right in and immediately locked the doors. The man at this point caught up to me and walked over to the passenger side of my car. Fortunately, I had already locked it so he couldn't get in. Not even bothering to put my seatbelt on, I started my engine and drove out of the parking lot quickly. Once I felt safe enough, I put my seatbelt on and flagged down a member of security for the transportation system. I saw that the man who stalked me was still at the station, so I pointed him out and explained what happened. The security officer looked a bit annoyed, but it wasn't annoyance with me. It was an annoyance like, I can't believe this happened again. He told me he'd take it from there, and I thanked him before driving back to my apartment. A few days later, I bought pepper spray, and ever since that evening, I have never left my apartment without it. I keep it out and ready to be used, and fortunately I haven't had a repeat of being stalked in my car. It scares me to think, though, what would have happened if I didn't lock my doors on time? What would have the stranger done to me? Would he have pulled out a weapon or tried to take advantage of me? This is unfortunately an everyday reality for us femme-presenting individuals. A Very Bad Situation, submitted by Tenuous Todd. Todd isn't my real name, and none of the names used in this are real for the same reason. Everyone wants to be someone anonymous on the internet. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee in the mid-2000s. Decent family, no crazy problems. My parents busted their humps to provide for me and my sister. Both of us were star athletes in high school, and both of us ended up going to college on full rides. I played basketball, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I said, growing up was good. Despite my parents working all the time, they made it their business to make sure me and my sis got good grades, were really involved in school activities, and at least one of them always came to our games. I did play football and baseball, but junior year gave them up to focus on hoop. Most of my friends were also on the sports teams, but two of my buddies from early on were not. They really weren't into anything other than video games, but we always got along, and I hung out with them a lot still. In high school, they started smoking a lot of weed and would come to my games and act crazy, getting the crowds fired up before usually getting kicked out. Funny guys for sure. They soon became the connection for the town when it came to pot, and when I went to college, they did graduate, and they moved in together. They also worked at a service station, but that was more of a front for their selling. By my sophomore year, they had bought the station and invested heavily in it, and made it a good business for a couple of 20-year-olds. I saw them on breaks and in the summer. It was the same old thing, just goofing around. I stuck with beers, but they were all-out partiers. Chris had bought a house with a giant yard and a pool, and Rick moved in with him. I never thought where they were getting all the money, but I did find out later. When I was in college playing, again, I'm not sharing what school I went to, they would call all the time asking about my teammates and stuff like that. I kind of figured out what they were looking for and realized that they were not only dealing, but they were also running a pretty big book back home. Over time, they had made a lot of connections in the sports world, and the service station now became not just a front for their drugs, but for their gambling. My senior year, I was getting a sniff at some pro options. I realized even my little time hanging out with them was a bad idea for my image, as the scouts were on top of everything. Seriously, it was like the FBI or something. It was a good thing. That winter their empire came to an end. They got raided by locals and feds, and it broke up their operation. I don't know all the ins and outs of what happened, but they gave up a lot of people to save their own butts. They had always been looked at as good guys, even though everyone knew what they were doing. But they always gave back to the community and were on boards and everything. People looked the other way, saying it was just weed and some sports betting. I ended up taking a deal to play in Europe with hopes of making some waves to go pro in the States, and I learned a lot. Mostly that I was not going to be an NBA star. But I did get involved in some legitimate businesses and an offer to bring one of them back to the States. I did, and it was a reversal of fortune of sorts. However, both Chris and Rick started hitting me up for money, or asking for it in exchange for drugs, which I was not into. They were now living in a trailer on some rented land and really going downhill. I helped them out a little, and I mean little, and it was all handled through the mail with signed receipts. Personal loans for friends. My business took off, and I had opened up an office in Chattanooga not far from where I grew up, and it started thriving. I met a woman, got married, and things were just rolling along in my life. I went home to visit my parents and sister, and my dad asked me about Chris and Rick. I really hadn't seen them or spoke to them in a few months, and they hadn't hit me up for cash in quite some time. It was Christmas time, and Chelsea and I were going to stay with my parents for the holidays. She was from Portugal. She and my mom went out shopping, and my dad was going to my uncle's cabin to hunt. I used to hunt, but was not down with it for whatever reason that day. That afternoon, I went to a local watering hole after doing some shopping of my own. It's a little town, but we do have some cool mom and pop shops with unique gifts. But this is where my story gets bad. Sorry for the backstory, but I wanted everyone to know a little bit about my friends and how they stayed in my life. So I went into the place around 4 o'clock for a beer and a sandwich and to shoot the shit with all the old-timers who were all into basketball. They all remembered me in my high school and college days and were asking about my dad, just the usual small-town stuff. A little while later, in comes, you guessed it, Chris and Rick. They looked awful. Skinny as hell, gray skin that seemed to be hanging on their bones, and they were wearing dirty clothes and smelled like hell. Of course, they saw me and started yelling and going crazy. They ordered drinks, and I could tell the old-timers were not too thrilled. Chris and Rick were already messed up on something, and they were talking so fast I could barely keep up with them as the afternoon turned into evening. At one point, they both went to the bathroom and came out much quieter. They kind of stopped talking and just either stared at the TV or looked at one another. I had stopped at 2 beers and was ready to go home when Chris asked me if I could give them a ride. He also said he had something he'd been wanting to give me, a gift from his bookie days. He said he had a signed Rick Nash jersey, my favorite player. I knew they likely had no ride home, and said, "I don't need the jersey, but I will take you home." We all got into my Volvo, and right away I thought it was weird that they both got in the back seat. Normally guys fight over shotgun, but they just drunkenly got in and didn't say a word other than where the trailer was. Chris gave directions, slurring his words, and I really didn't want to be there all of a sudden. They both went silent again, and we pulled down a dirt road to their trailer. I parked and said, "Here you go, guys, happy holidays," thinking I could get out of going inside. But Chris insisted that he get this jersey. Like an idiot, I followed him inside while Rick went over to a shed a little ways away from the trailer. The place was a dump and smelled worse than them. The entire thing was filled with empty beer and liquor bottles, dishes, crap all over the place. It was like that Hoarders show. Just super gross. Chris said the jersey was in his room, and he made his way through the filth and disappeared. I stood there for a few minutes wanting to leave but not be a dick, and that's when I noticed I didn't hear him rummaging around anymore. Things had gotten quiet. That's when I got the feeling I should get the hell out of there right away. I turned and went out the front door, and as I stepped down from the trailer, I heard a noise from the shed, and out stumbled Rick. He had a flashlight and something else in his hand that I couldn't see. A bunch of smoke came out from the door, and he stepped over to me, and I could smell something burning or scorching him. It was just really bad. It reeked. "Sure is good to see you home," he said, and laughed this crazy laugh. I just said, "Well, yeah, but I gotta get going." And he said, "Nah, I think you need to stick around a little while." And he held up this glass pipe thing. "Go on, hit it, man." I had never seen meth before, let alone smoked it, and I just said, "Nah, no thanks, brother." That's when Chris's voice came from behind me and said, "That's not nice, turning down our hospitality." I turned, and he was holding a shotgun and was not looking very friendly anymore. "Smoke that shit right now," he said, and held up the gun. I nearly shit my pants. In a fair fight, I knew I could take both of them in the shape they were. But when I saw that Rick had a knife as well, I knew this was bad. "You're going to smoke that, give me the keys to your car, and give me your fucking wallet," said Chris. I had zero options. My car was behind me, and my mind was spinning. They kept walking slowly towards me, Rick still holding out the pipe thing. "Talk your way out of this," I kept saying to myself. "Just stall." They were both within striking distance, and I said, "Look, guys, you can have my wallet and I'll leave, but I can't share your stuff with you." Chris just laughed and said, "You're going to smoke it now, basketball boy." Rick handed the pipe to me and stood with the knife at the ready. They were both laughing this crazy laugh, and I said, "Guys, I don't know how to do this." Chris reached into his pocket, and at that moment, I have no idea why I did what I did. I spun as hard as I could and smashed this glass pipe against his forehead, part of it getting into his left eye. He screamed, and blood started coming out of his eye, and Rick just stood there. Chris let the shotgun drop, and again, out of nowhere, I thought to kick it as far away as I could. He just kept yelling. Rick was looking at him saying, "Dude, you okay, dude? You okay?" I took that chance, ran to my Volvo, jumped in, started it up. The last thing I saw was the two of them in the headlights as I slammed it in reverse, turned it around on the grass, and I heard a thud on the back window. They had thrown something at me. I got back to the main road as quick as I could, and I looked at my hand. It was bleeding really bad. So I grabbed a hat I had on the front seat and wrapped it around it. We didn't have a hospital in town, but there was a sheriff's outpost, so I flew up there and ran up to the door. Thankfully, a sheriff was in. I quickly told him what had happened, and he said he'd call EMS to look at my hand, and was worried about whatever was in the pipe getting into my body. He made a call to the other sheriffs, and a bunch of them went out to Chris's place while I got looked at. They found them both completely strung out on meth, and Chris had a ruptured eyeball. He kept saying my name, and that I attacked him, and he wanted me arrested. Yeah, right. At the end of this, both did get arrested for all kinds of drug stuff. I didn't bother pressing any charges, as they really didn't do anything to me other than threaten me. They were already in enough trouble as it was, the way I saw it. Anyway, that night I got bandaged up, and the sheriffs told me to go have a doctor take a look at it the next day, and I just went home, still shaken up and scared out of my mind. Chelsea and my mom freaked out when they saw the blood on my sleeve and on my hand. I told them the whole story, and then grabbed a stiff scotch to calm down. Long story short, both of those guys went to jail, and a bunch of stuff that they had squeaked out from their last brush with the law was revoked, and stiff prison time came their way. I put it all behind me and enjoyed the holidays before going back home and going to work. I kind of put it out of my mind until this past summer. I got a Facebook friend request from Chris. He sent me a message that said, "Steve Nash was a great player. How are you?" I deleted it. Chelsea and I have 3 kids now and live in Tampa, and my parents just moved to Naples. I haven't been back home since, and I don't ever plan on it. The People in the Van, submitted by Jen Y. My story takes place in a smallish city, a university town in Canada. It was summer, so much quieter than during the school year. And this is a reason I felt like I could do what I did, but I did regret it quickly. I lived in an apartment building in a group of buildings, and beside it was a large grocery store, and just past that, a convenience store. Just past that, a video store. It was 2003, so we still went and rented copies of movies when they came out. The big box store closed at 11 p.m., but the convenience and movie stores closed at midnight. I was in my apartment around 11:30, and my roommate decided to go to her boyfriend's place, so I found myself alone with the TV to myself, and I looked out the window overlooking the parking lot of the big box store. It was completely empty, but the other stores just past it were open and busy, so I thought, I'll grab a movie, some snacks, and enjoy my time alone to the fullest. I grabbed some cash and took off to the stores, planning my evening filled with snacks and whatever I wanted to watch. I went to the video store first and took my time, and left with maybe 5 minutes left to get snacks at the store on the way home. I ran over, went in, grabbed a bunch of stuff, went to the register, paid, and left. They were locking the door as I left. When I got outside, it was so dark without the lights of the stores. My house felt like a mile away, although it was close. I could see it. I felt anxious walking through the deserted parking lot, so I took the long way on the sidewalk and felt a little safer. I was just about to go past the fence that separated the parking lot and our apartment buildings when a minivan drove by me. The people in the van were obviously pointing and yelling and making it obvious to me they were pointing me out to the driver. The driver reacted, but luckily not immediately. He did a quick left turn at the lights behind me and drove at full speed through the parking lot to the exit where the fence was, where I was still standing. I got the fuck out of there and ran to my apartment, which was the first one. I opened the door and ran up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I didn't turn on any lights and ran to the living room window overlooking the parking lot. The van had stopped right where I had been standing, and several people, at least 6 of them, were out of the van walking in every direction from where I was. They were obviously talking and looking for me. And these people were out there looking for me. I had no idea why. I had no idea who they were, and let me tell you, I did not want to find out. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't spotted me almost literally outside my door, or if I lived in the next building over. I might not have even made it, as it's hard to outrun a vehicle. I'd never heard of any random attacks in that area, but I often wonder if maybe I would have been the first. I should mention that we have a very transient population anyway. I did a full snack check of my house prior to 11 p.m. every night for the rest of my lease, and then I moved to an even sketchier neighborhood. But that's a story for another time. My Stories, submitted by Alex B. This story takes place in a New Mexican town called Alamogordo. It's a smaller town in the south, very old, and one part of it is known for being very haunted. My dad was a police officer there for a long time, and would often get called to the downtown area for strange occurrences that couldn't be rationally explained. For example, there was one business there that, after being locked up, would have every door open from the inside with nothing being taken, or nothing vandalized, and the alarm not sounding, even though the owner swears he armed it. My experiences were in this part of town. As a teenager, I would help my mom at her work in a former sheriff's office that now serves as a probation office. I would help her file paperwork or keep her company after hours. There was something about this office that was a magnet for all kinds of paranormal activity. And as another note, it would be important later, is that the upper office, and I say upper because the upper and lower offices are separated by 2 small steps, just seemed to house more benign spirits or whatever they were. And the lower offices would have a more malevolent presence. In my early adulthood, I was a probation officer in the same office, so I would put my time here around 5 years or so. And I'll start at the beginning, when my mom worked there. Very little would happen during working hours. People would be in and out, typing on the computers, sending faxes, regular work stuff. Everybody was usually gone by 5, and I swear at 5:01, the place would really come alive. Footsteps, copy machines turning on by themselves, even a growling noise that I heard a few times. My mom would always try to avoid working late alone. And the 2 stories that she told me that stand out the most was one time where she was working late, typing on the computer, when she felt a presence. She looked up, and standing at the front of her desk was a man, plain as you and me, wearing Old West-style clothes, just looking at her. She said that she felt no fear of him, and just went back to typing. then realized what had happened, and when she looked up, he was gone. She left shortly afterwards, but not feeling afraid. The other story was the time that she was just getting into her car right as the sun was going down. She caught a glimpse of a shadow nearby, and when she looked, it was rising above a trash can, looking like a large man and floating towards her car. This one did scare her, and as she was leaving, the shadow was following close behind until she left the parking area. There is more from her time there, but nothing too scary. The next part of my story is a few interesting things that came from us meddling with the office after hours. Nothing truly terrifying, but definitely some weird things happening. One Halloween, my mom, my brother, and a couple of his friends and I went there, bringing with us some very amateur versions of the tools from ghost hunters. Because my mom was part of the underage drinking prevention program, she had a thermal camera. Why this was needed for her work and how she justified getting it through the county, I'll never know. But we had one, and it was pretty cool. We also brought a psychic circle, which is a budget-friendly and, dare I say, less evil version of the Ouija board. But it worked. So the first thing that we did was break out the psychic circle and ask the usual questions. That was weird because as it answered questions, the glass that you hold would spin on the board, causing people to have to take their hands off of it as it moved. So no one could really be messing with it, as we never had much time with our hands on the thing. The other weird thing about that was the fact that you could tell when you had a different personality on the other end. It would go from moving slowly, almost politely, using polite and encouraging words, to very fast and chaotic, aggressive in a way, and using threatening words. It would often slide very quickly and aggressively off the board and towards my mom. It would go from nice to threatening systematically. It was pretty weird. The feeling in the room would change too. Literally hot and cold, scary and calm. What it said I can't remember. What I do remember is the general feeling surrounding the different personalities we would get. After we were done with this, we wandered around the office, one time seeing a door open and close on its own. It did this for a minute or so. And the really scary thing that happened that night was in a small room occupied only by a chair. The room felt strange, but nothing was really happening there. It just felt off. So we looked around seeing nothing of interest until we brought out the thermal camera. Once we looked through it, the chair was hot. It literally looked like someone was currently sitting in it. The whole room was blue except for that chair. It was orange and red. Nobody could have been in that chair for at least 6 hours. Yet there it was, glowing on the camera. Okay, so now that I've shared a few things about that, I'll get to the part that still scares me when I think about it, 14 years later. I began working there shortly after school. I began working there shortly after high school. I took over my mom's position when she left to become a teacher. Since I was independent of everyone else and afraid of screwing it up, I'd often stay late after everybody went home. A lot would happen the moment that everyone left. Footsteps were the most common, but they wouldn't even scare me. They were such a common occurrence. Loud, obvious footsteps just outside my office, going up and down the hall, almost constant. I didn't like going into the lower offices when no one was there. For one, almost 100% of the time. The second I stepped foot down there, a computer or copier or light or something would turn on. Every damn time. Also, the feeling was not good. It wasn't cool or scary. It was miserable. The feeling in that lower office was sadness, hate, and, to simply put, evil. It's hard to describe, but it would make you feel sick. I mean, just bad in a general way. Something strange that happened on a time when I was there a few minutes late. My girlfriend came to visit, and as we were talking, I felt a gentle shake on the headrest of my chair. I mean, I swear it felt like a polite way of telling me, hey, it's after 5. Our time now. Off you go. So we just left. All right, I'm dragging the story out. I'll get to the good part. This part goes back to when I was a teenager. My friend and I were at the office because my mom was working late. Very late, around 9 in the evening. While my mom was typing in the office, he and I were kicking a stress ball around in the hall. We were bored and just entertaining ourselves. My mom asked us to stop because the more noise we made, the more she would get a bad feeling in the office. It was like we were pissing something off. Well, soon we felt it too, and it did get worse. Soon we were scared. My mom decided it was time to leave, and as we were about to walk out, I heard growling coming from the lower office. Literal growling. It sounded exactly like my dog Buster. He was an asshole and growled a lot, but he wasn't there. And suddenly the growling stopped, but there was a light on in the very back of the lower offices that wasn't on before. I was a very confident big kid at 17, not afraid of much, so my mom asked me to go and turn the light off. No one else had heard the growling, and I didn't mention it. So there I went, down to the lower office, completely dark besides the one light in the back office. A strange feeling came over me. Fear was there, sure, but this was a feeling like I couldn't move, as if my brain was telling my body, nope, you can't walk, so don't try. But I could walk, so I plodded forward, slowly and deliberately. As I got closer to the office, the feeling grew, and it mingled with dread. I finally made it there, and I poked my head into the office and reached for the light switch, when I saw something swaying out of the corner of my eye. I turned and looked, light still on, and saw a man, a noose around his neck. It looked as though he had his tongue and eyes ripped out, and somehow he'd been set on fire. His skin was dark and burned, eye sockets empty and black, and as I looked directly at him, he turned his head down towards me, as if he was looking at me with the sockets where his eyes used to be. I caught his gaze for a fraction of a second before I turned and ran. I didn't say anything, and my mom and friends saw the look on my face and took my running as a sign to get the hell out of there. I'll never forget that thing. Days later, I told my mom what I saw, but she didn't believe me. Even though she'd seen things, she couldn't believe what I saw. That is until years later after she stopped working there. She and an old co-worker were talking about how strange that place was when her co-worker told her a story very similar to what I saw. After that, she did some research into the area. The old courthouse across the street was one of the first buildings in that town. Where we used to work used to be a saloon. People would be tried in that courthouse, sentenced to be hanged, and the barred patrons would watch. Some of these hangings would involve setting the person on fire and cutting out their eyes. I don't know what it was about that building. Nothing paranormal outside of it has ever happened to me. But I know that some places hold on to things, and I know the feeling of pure evil thanks to this place. The building's no longer standing. It was torn down to make a parking lot, but the memories of that place will stay with me forever. Just Know It's Only Me, submitted by Jacqueline C. Growing up, I was always fond of scary stories and the supernatural, mostly thanks to my grandma. When she visited, I looked forward to trips to the public library, where we would find a quiet corner to sit in, and she would read me all the scary storybooks every time in Spanish. Scary stories became something we bonded over. Every time she visited, I would ask her, "Grandma, could you tell me a scary story?" And we would end up staying up late into the night, sharing scary stories. I was my grandma's favorite. She'd always have a story or a song for me. As an adult, I've grown to appreciate all that time we spent together in storytelling mode. She would tell me all kinds of scary stories, as told by her friends or heard around her town, urban legends, and some had happened to her and her children firsthand. I could write a book about all her scary stories. When I was a teenager, she began to bring clippings of a local newspaper from her town that printed a section on scary stories. There was something about hearing her read them aloud in the middle of the night, after she'd caught me up on her own town gossip. One night, she read a story about a child who would feel spirits tugging at his ankles and feet, and sometimes feeling someone or something cover him up with a blanket in the middle of the night. "When I die," she'd start, "I might pull your feet or cover you up, but just know it's only me," she would say. "Grandma," I would say, half concerned, half scared, "you're not going to die. Don't say that." As the years passed, not only did she end our scary story sessions like that, she would say it a lot more often in conversation with our family. It became somewhat of a joke, and we would all half chuckle about it. My grandma died unexpectedly. She'd fallen sick with severe stomach pains, but never did we think that this would take her out. She was a very strong-headed, strong-willed woman, and to this day, it surprises us the way that she went. I just turned 18 and was going to have a 50s rock and roll theme party that weekend. I remember asking her if she was going to make it over the phone. "I don't think so, my girl," she said. The phone calls to Mexico were becoming more frequent since she had fallen ill, but we were all oblivious to the possibility of her death. "I love you so much, Grandma." I got to say that to her on our last phone call. She died a day before my birthday party. The Friday before the party, I'd gone to an outing with a club from school. It was an after-school field trip to a Moroccan restaurant with belly dancers, an effort to have a different cultural eating experience. I remember having so much fun, and all of a sudden, my world literally felt like it slowed down. Almost as if I'd been drinking, but I swear no one was having any booze that night. Not even the teacher chaperones that were in charge. Something's off, I remember feeling. I've always been somewhat of an intuitive with these things. So was my mom. It was as if I already knew something was up. One of the teachers was dropping off all the kids back to their homes instead of the school, and on our way from the city back to the burbs, my close cousin called me up. "Hey, Jay," she said, kind of sad and distant. "Hey," I said. "What's up? I'm coming home from the coolest field trip. They had belly dancers and we got to eat with our hands," I shared excitingly. "Oh," she said, still sounding kind of distant. "Have you spoken with your mom or sister?" "No," I said, and grew concerned. Something definitely was up. She would usually text, not call. "Oh, okay," she said. "Call me when you get home, okay? Have fun." I could tell she was really trying hard to be cheerful. When I was dropped off, the front gate to our home was wide open. That's freaking weird, I thought. My mom was always particular about keeping that gate closed. I walked up to the front door and swung it open. It was my sister at the door. "I'm so sorry, Jay. I'm so sorry," she started, and then burst into tears. "It's Grandma. She died." I couldn't believe it. I instinctively looked around the room for my father, as it was his mother, and ran into his arms, and we both cried so hard. I'd never seen my dad cry, like, ever. Everything was feeling surreal at that point. After we cried, and I was caught up on the plane to fly out for her wake, I retreated to my room to cry some more. The drunk feeling was way strong by then. I felt weak and knelt by the side of my bed to sob some more. In the middle of my softer sobbing, I could have sworn I heard an owl hoot. It hooted twice before I stopped to listen. Then I heard a clear last third hoot. That's freaking weird, I thought. Never in my life had I ever seen an owl in the burbs or heard an owl so close to my window like that. The vibes got a bit ominous in the room. Then I remembered all the things my grandmother would say she'd do when she died. I grew anxious and scared. Should I be expecting her to show up? Is she going to look scary? Is she going to pull my feet tonight? I decided to sleep with my parents that night and held off on telling them about the hoots I'd heard. I couldn't believe it myself. There I was, an 18-year-old crawling into the middle of her parents' bed the night her grandma died in case she decided to show up. Nobody really slept that night. We were going to catch an early flight out to Mexico in just a few hours, so we all just kind of laid awake for a while, sparsely talking about Grandma. Then, right around 3 a.m.-ish, and I know it was that time, that's when I was expecting her the most, there was soft murmuring that began to arise right outside my parents' room. It started slow, and then it began to swell up. I woke up my parents fast. My mom had already heard it. I think she was expecting something, too. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to them both and tried to lay still. They didn't respond. "Do you hear it?" I whispered louder. The murmuring sounded like a group of people praying. My grandmother was Catholic, and I had heard her pray so many times growing up. But it was odd that it was a group of voices. It sounded as if they were moving across the living room right outside my parents' door. Yes, my mom finally said. My dad got up, slowly. He's the skeptic in our family. And he went out to investigate the sound. The sounds faded as he walked out of the room. And when he returned, he said he didn't see anything, or anyone. We flew out to Mexico, and honestly, the trip was a blur. I remember thinking how we'd only been about a 3-hour flight from each other this whole time. And I was still in somewhat of a shock, I think. My grandparents lived in a town way out from the main city, so we had a drive ahead of us after arriving at the airport. I do remember pulling up to their house, suitcase in hand, and trekking up the dirt road that led to their front gate. I'd only ever visited them twice in my life at that point, and was sad that this time it was to say goodbye. There was a crowd of people dressed in black spilling out of the front door and front gate. Some were townspeople, some were family I'd never even met before. As we made our way closer, I began to hear people praying, the rosary, and it sounded just like the low murmurs we had heard just a few hours ago in our living room. We got to the front gate, and someone announced my dad's arrival. "Make way for the family," someone said. I followed behind. In Mexico, people usually hold wakes inside the dead person's home, and I was not expecting to see my grandmother lying lifeless like that at all. I didn't want to see her dead, but my mom reassured me she'd be with me, and she was right behind me the whole time. We got in line, and soon enough it was my turn to peer at the carcass left of my dear grandma. I looked over the coffin, and I could smell the formaldehyde from where I stood. Her face didn't look the same. She had way too much makeup on, and it was definitely not her shade or the way she would have liked it to be. Anyway, a couple of weird things happened in the days preceding our arrival. We slept in her room while her casket and body was still in the living room, and people stayed to pray over her body overnight. We heard shuffling as if someone was sweeping the driveway in the early morning. Grandma was an early riser and always did morning chores around the house. And my brother swore it. Someone touched his hair while he was half awake one morning. She was very fond of his curly hair. The body was taken for a service and a burial after the second or third day. My sister wasn't able to make the trip to Mexico in time, so she stayed home. But she told us she had a dream where my grandma was so upset about her makeup and her face being left like that. Mind you, my sister had no idea what Grandma looked like in the casket, but somehow dreamt about it. Throughout the years, I was so afraid she would show up at my bedside. So much so, it would cause me anxiety, and I lost a lot of sleep. I used to feel her a lot more before, but now it's only when I call upon her or when something I do reminds me of her. But I know that she always has been close by. Everybody, hug your grandmas. They are so precious, and the storytellers, story keepers of your family. Don't Drive Down Dirt Roads by OK Lemon. So this happened right before my 20th birthday, when I was in the U.S. Navy. I'm a female, and I was stationed at a Navy school in South Carolina the entirety of my enlistment, close to Charleston, but not actually in the city. It wasn't uncommon for people with cars to drive into the city, and everyone was friends with someone with a car. Me and my class leader, a 22-year-old male, we'll call him P, were really close, and he was friends with this New Yorker, a 19-year-old man that I didn't much like. We'll call him T. But T had a car, so we ended up doing a lot together. One night, after all three of us had tanked an important test, I convinced them to go for ice cream. We decided on this little mom-and-pop type shop on the far side of Charleston and piled into T's truck. After we had gotten our ice cream, P went to start giving T directions. T couldn't find his way out of a shoebox, but T insisted he knew a shortcut, and we needed to just enjoy the ride. We didn't have anything early the next day, so I figured, F it, this'll probably be a funny story later when T gets us lost. So we were driving for at least twice as long as it would have taken to get back to base, but T kept promising we're almost there. Meanwhile, we hadn't seen a building in at least 10 miles, and the road was so dark I felt like I was looking into the abyss. T mentioned that he had to pee, So P and I told him to just pull over and take a leak. The road was lined with forest, so he had options to save his dignity, but he insisted on pulling all the way off the road. So T found a dirt road and turned down it. P and I looked at each other and both said, "Hey, you need to stop." P and I are both from the South, while T grew up mostly in New York City. So P and I both knew how real shoot first, ask questions later it could be. But T kept saying he was just going to go a little further through the trees. I was thinking about how we were going to get shot because I wanted ice cream, and then we broke through the tree line. At about 20 yards in front of us was a big bonfire that was bright compared to the light from the new moon. Immediately my stomach dropped, and P and I both started screaming at T to turn around. That's when we noticed the figures around the fire and those closing in around us. T was frozen in the driver's seat, so I reached into the front and put the truck in reverse while hitting him repeatedly in the shoulder. T slowly turned around to check behind him to back up only for him to freeze again. I turned and saw more figures closing around the trail behind us. P by now had pulled out a flashlight and was trying to blind the figures while repeatedly telling T to just go and that they'd move. So T started to slowly make his way back while P was whipping his flashlight around, and I was making sure all the doors were locked and rolled up the rear windows and closed the back sliding window. The crowd parted like we were Moses and they were the Red Sea, and we made it back onto the road without any other problems. We rode the rest of the ride in almost complete silence, and the three of us have never actually spoken about it since. The only thing that was said the ride home was when P turned to me and said, "They didn't have any faces."